Andy Edwards. Never heard of him.
Hello there and welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be going through who I think are the 10 greatest British jazz musicians. I'm accompanied by my pipe. Of course, I don't smoke tobacco, so this pipe is an air pipe. There's nothing in it, but I thought it would add to the Britishness of this video. I've also got a cravat, and you know, with a stroke of luck, I've got some very dramatic lighting. Caracuzio or whatever what's it called, that word? Caracuzio? Anyway, you can see that there's the harsh lighting, there's the pipe. And I think I'm ready to go through who I think are the 10 greatest jazz artists. This time, on this list, I've actually pulled out an album which I think would be a great album if you want to go and check that artist out. Not saying it's their best album, but it's one I've pulled out from my own personal collection. An album, sometimes 2 albums for the artists. Also, what can I tell you about this video that might be of interest before we start? I've got some runners-up as well. Now, my approach has been really to think which British artists go beyond the realm of British jazz. Which British artists have been able to get out of the UK and create a reputation wider than just these shores. And I think once you put that idea in there, it starts to cut down the numbers. Now, it would be lovely to do a list that represents the history of British jazz. You know, we could look at the likes of Humphrey Lyttelton, Ken Collier, Chris Barber, the sort of trad jazz musicians from the 1940s. We could even go back before then to people like Sid Phillips. When bebop starts to hit the UK and you get the likes of Ronnie Scott and Johnny Dankworth taking from that, you know, we could be picking from those. And these are legendary musicians, you know. In the 60s, you have people like Pat Smythe, Stan Tracy. There's a whole bunch of musicians. Chris Mayer, the Brotherhood of Breath. Well, I have stayed away from those because of my rule of looking at musicians that went beyond these shores. So, I don't know if I've got my ranking correct, and the person I've got at number 10 makes me doubt my ranking, but we'll get into it. So, if I just put my pipe down there, the guy I've got at number 10, and as soon as I show you this guy, you may think, oh yeah, I hadn't thought of him. And then when you think about it, you realise he's one of the greatest players on his instrument in the world at the moment. The incredibly underrated and the incredibly talented Mr. Martin Taylor. I've got his 3rd album here, right going back to 1982, which is called Skyboat. This is a great album. It's one of the albums that sort of launched his reputation. We've got also Peter Ind on bass on here and Jimmy Smith on drums. I'm going to mention the musicians on the album because sometimes it just gives you a pointer to sort of other musicians that were coming around on the scene. Now, why Martin Taylor? Well, I think Martin Taylor has gone on to become one of the truly great guitarists in the world at the moment. I often feel that when we talk about guitarists, there's a sort of league of guitarists that go beyond. The sort of Joe Passes, the Lenny Bros, the guys that can do it all, fingerstyle, plectrum, they can do bits of country picking, you know, classical, and they have that full facility under their fingers. Martin Taylor is an absolute genius in that style, and an incredible guitar player. Not just the virtuosity, but his touch on guitar. Now, I believe he came from a relatively working class background. He got an association, I think purely through his incredible talent on the guitar, with the guitarist Ike Isaacs, a guitarist that has he's in a group of guitar players that I think are getting forgotten as time goes on. Don't worry about it. I've actually been in contact with Martin, and we are going to do a video where we really look at the history of guitar and cover a whole bunch of guitarists that I think are getting forgotten. Guitarists that really laid the groundwork for how the guitar is played, but that's another discussion. Ike Isaacs then introduced Martin Taylor to Stefan Grappelli, and he then went on to play with Stefan Grappelli for many, many years, you know, stepping into shoes of guitar players, not just Django Reinhardt, but a whole raft of guitar players that are absolutely incredible. And I think going around the world and doing that with Stefan has created a worldwide audience for Martin. And to this day, he, you know, every time I speak to him, because he has become an associate because of his incredible interview he did on Jazz Guitarists on this channel. And when I did that interview with him, I didn't pay him, I felt, enough respect, and just point out that Martin Taylor is one of the greatest guitarists on the planet. He really is, in so many ways. So, yeah, as an early album, if you get hold of a copy of that, I think the famous ones, of course, is this one, Martin Taylor, Spirit of Django, amazing. He's also got John Goldie on rhythm guitar, Alec Dankworth on bass, obviously the son of Johnny Dankworth. We've got Dave O'Higgins on tenor and soprano sax, one of the Britain's great saxophone players, Jack Emblow on accordion, and James Taylor on snare drum. It's a great album. And I think if there's one guy that is able to explore the spirit of Django without getting tied into all that thing, because his voice is strong enough, there's a number of guitarists I think that can do that. Martin Taylor is one. I have to mention, in the same breath as Martin Taylor, another associate with the channel, and he nearly made it onto this list, which is the great John Etheridge, known to many as you as the guitarist in the band Soft Machine, but another guitarist who also was associated with Stefan Grappelli, who has played around the world, and an absolutely incredible player, able to go from almost like, you know, sort of that legato jazz fusion all the way to classical guitar, you know, a proper guitar player. We have in this country punched above our weight when it comes to guitarists, and you will see there's a number of guitarists still to come. Anyway, that is number 10, Martin Taylor. Shall we move on to number 9 now? Again, I feel this is very low on the list, and I feel that this guy has become world class on not just one instrument, but an almost, I can't think of anybody else that's done this, but a world class jazz musician on 2 instruments. That is, of course, the great Gary Husband. Or I can show you a little picture when he was young. There he is. Gary is an incredible musician. I think what he did on drums at the age of 19, 20 in the Allan Holdsworth group, for me, changed the way you play drums behind an improvising musician. The emergence of those Holdsworth albums at the same time as Shut Up and Play Guitar, Frank Zappa with Vinnie Colaiuta on drums, brought an approach to time. It brought a velocity and a freedom that actually we didn't have in the fusion drummers that went before. They really were bringing in soul and rock across into a improvisational context. For me, when I'm playing drums, high-powered drums behind a soloist, my style's coming out of Gary Husband or Vinnie Colaiuta, really. And then players that came in afterwards. I think it was revolutionary what he did. Of course, he has since gone on to become a world-class pianist. He is currently playing, I think, in Billy Cobham's band. Before that, he was the keyboardist for many, many years in John McLaughlin's band. This guy is quite incredible. Now, I did review this album when it came out. I think this is a brilliant album. If you want to go and check out Gary and what he's done musically, this is an incredible album to get. It came out this year, I think, or last year. It's called Postcards from the Past. Really go and check this album out. The lineup is insane. We've got Steve Topping on here, Ray Worley, we know late great Ray Worley, another brilliant British jazz musician. Randy Brecker's on here, Paul Williams is on here, Paul Carmichael. We've got Michael Mondesir, who is an incredible bass player and the brother of Mark Mondesir, a huge influence on me as well as a drummer, and a guy that nearly made this list. He is sort of on this list. We'll get to that when we get to that, I think. We got Matthew Garrison on here, Jerry Goodman, Hansford Rowe, and right at the top, probably most interesting for Fusion fans, is we've got Allan Holdsworth on here. This album not only is an overview of 40, 50 years of Gary's career, but it also contains some recordings from those very early Holdsworth albums, the IOU period, which, if you know your Holdsworth, you'll know the famous story that they recorded the first IOU album, and then that mix mysteriously disappeared, and they had to go in and do it again. And although it's gone on to be one of the greatest fusion albums ever made, Gary and a few other people that knew it seem to think that the one before was even more fiery and incredible. And there are some recordings on here which he believes comes from those sessions, those early sessions, and they have an aspect to them which I haven't heard on the Holdsworth album. There's also another track on here which is pre-IOU. It's very interesting if you're a Holdsworth fan to go and check that out. So yes, Gary Husband, world-class musician, played with everybody, absolutely incredible. Now, it's very difficult to talk about the British jazz scene without getting ensconced into what happened in the 1980s. So around about 85, there was suddenly this explosion of British jazz in my country that crossed over. It got in the charts, it got on mainstream television. You were having these musicians cropping up on programs like The Tube or Terry Wogan's Chat Show. And the guy that really heralded that movement, and I'm going to put in to represent all of that, was the incredible Courtney Pine. I've pulled out the second album. I am very attached to the first album. It always blows my mind what this quintet was doing on the second album was something really special. This was post-Coltrane modal jazz. It was very free. It also had aspects of reggae, a little bit of fusion in there to some extent. This lineup on here, which is Courtney Pine tenor saxophone, Julian Joseph on piano, Mark Mondesir on drums. We've got Paul Hunt on bass, but Gary Crosby also crops up on bass as well. This is the classic British, 80s Renaissance group of musicians. On the other side, you have the whole Loose Tubes lot, and you've got like Django Bates and Ian Bellamy, all incredible. For me, there was something magical about this group. I went to see them a couple of times, and it was on fire. And I ended up following Mark Mondesir, who, for me, if you look at the musicians involved in this, was the one guy that went on to play with international artists, going on to play with the likes of John McLaughlin, going on to play with the likes of Jeff Beck, Jan Hammer. And I think perhaps him having that wide remit stopped Mark from being seen as being part of this group in a way, because these players all stayed very British jazz mindset, and they've all gone on to get their MBEs and OBEs or whatever they've got, except for Mark. I watched this group over and over again. It was brimming with talent. But for me, the guy that was astonishing was Mark Mondesir. So Mark is included in this here. And that means I'm not going to be talking about Andy Shepherd or Tommy Smith or Steve Williamson or any of those great players that came out of the British jazz scene at that time. It really would overwhelm this list, and they're incredible. The thing is, most of them stayed local and are not known outside of this country. Okay. The 1960s jazz scene is very fertile, and it's closely aligned with the development of rock music. In London, there is a scene that includes jazz musicians, but also folk musicians, blues rock musicians, and people interested in writing pop songs. And they're all working together. There's a whole bunch of musicians that emerge out of this scene, and they're going to feature here. I think one guy that's does not get mentioned, but has gone on to have an international career and has created a whole host of albums, which I think are really artistically up there with anything in the world of jazz, and that would be the great baritone sax player John Surman. Now, the album I'm going to pull out for people who watch this channel and are interested in this sort of stuff, of course, is this album, Where Fortune Smiles. Now, this is starting to get labelled up as a John McLaughlin album, and some people think it's a sort of a collaboration. I don't think it is. I'm pretty sure that this, even though the artwork mentions everybody on here, this is a John Surman album, really. John Surman, a very fiery baritone sax player, very virtuoso, and that's what this represents here. A few years after this was recorded in the 1970s, he started to make a number of albums. I wish I could remember the first album he'd done. It's something like the Wickery Docks or Dickory Docks or something. I can't remember. But if you can work it out from that, the Wickery. It's got a landscape on the front. This is the first. It made it in 1972. Can't remember the name of it. It was the first album where we started to use overdubbing. Now, people like Bill Evans have used overdubbing. Pat Metheny. A lot of jazz musicians have done it. I don't think anybody has done it as successfully as John Surman. And then later on, he signed to ECM Records, a strange label for him to go for, but the right label, because that sort of icy Norwegian photographic sound that they have is a brilliant production style, I think, for these sort of electronic and overdubbed passages. There's nothing quite like it in jazz, and that's why I wanted to mention John Surman here. I think he has got on a path which runs alongside jazz rock fusion, but is not jazz rock fusion. These albums sold all over the world. I think him being signed to ECM gave him an international following. And if I don't own this album, but if you want to get the album, I think, the great masterpiece, try The Adventures of Simon Simon that came out in 1982. Brilliant album. Right, so that's who I have got at whatever number that was. How many have we done now? Let's just check my list. So we are at number 7, and we are going on to number 6. And I've put Where Fortune Smiles away, and I didn't tell you the lineup, because the lineup on here is, of course, if I can find it, just want to double check it, I've got it right. Oh, it's one of those CDs where it's going to be really hard. So I'm going to have to go from my memory. So I would say that on this album we have... Oh, it's on the front cover, isn't it, you great big idiot? We've got John Surman, baritone sax. We've got Stu Martin on drums. John McLaughlin on guitar. Carl Berger, I think he's on vibes. And Dave Holland on bass. The great, from just up the road in Wolverhampton, the great Dave Holland. Not the drummer of Judas Priest, not the dodgy Dave Holland, right? Although he might have not been dodgy. That's another video altogether. Not the Judas Priest Dave Holland. No. The bass player that went from playing in Ronnie Scott's with John McLaughlin and John Surman and all these other British jazz musicians, the first to go to America, the first to land the gig with Miles Davis and be propelled to superstardom off that. But Dave Holland, unlike the likes of Chick Corea or Joe Zawinul or Wayne Shorter or John McLaughlin or Billy Cobham, all those guys that were going through Miles Davis at the time, he did not then just run to jazz rock fusion. He was far more interested in something that you could call free jazz, although I've never felt Dave Holland is a free jazz musician. But he is one of the greatest double bass players of the last 60 years. I would... who else rivals him in terms of, jazz innovation, reputation, composition, the whole thing that makes a great jazz artist? Who would rival Dave Holland at that time? You've probably got Charlie Haydn. You've got virtuosos like Niels Horst Pedersen, but I think not just as a bass player, as an artist, Dave Holland is really untouchable. He produced this absolute masterpiece. This is one of the greatest jazz albums ever made. Conference with the Birds, absolutely mind-blowing on ECM Records. Dave Holland on bass, Sam Rivers on saxes and flute, Anthony Braxman on saxes and flute, and then Barry Altschul on percussion and marimba. No real chordal influences. And on here, they explore an avenue of free jazz, which is actually quite accessible for free jazz. I absolutely love this album. He played on so many masterpiece albums. I can't list them all here. So many sessions that he did. But in the 1980s, he started to work with a whole bunch of musicians that would go on to change the face of jazz under the banner of M-Bass, the most obvious being Steve Coleman. He was working with these groups, these musicians throughout the 1980s. They produced a whole host of very free, swinging jazz fusion albums. I would class these as jazz fusion albums. This is, for me, one of my favourite albums ever made. It's mind-blowing. The Dave Holland Quartet extensions. This is an absolute masterpiece. The band is unbelievable. Dave Holland on bass, Steve Coleman alto saxophone. The great Kevin Eubanks, what happened to him? Why is nobody mentioning him anymore? Why isn't he, when we go old Schofield, Bill Frisell, Mike Stern, Scott Anderson, why aren't we mentioning, Kevin Eubanks? He was mind-blowing. He's incredible on here. And another incredible drummer, Marvin Smitty Smith. This is sort of odd time signature, dark fusion. It's quite acoustic in its sound. There's the electric guitar there. It's just mind-blowing. ECM Records came out in 1989. One of the greatest jazz or fusion albums of the 1980s. And this is why these guys are on the list. Right. There are a couple of geniuses that are much more local to the British jazz scene that if you were to get outside of the UK may not be as well known, whereas all the musicians I'm covering up to now are probably known by jazz fans outside the UK. Now, the album I'm about to pull up, I do not have the cover for, but it's definitely the album you're going to have to go and get. It is, if I just pick it up, this one. This was sent to me by a viewer in a whole box of albums, incredible albums. But this one was the one where oh my God, I finally own a copy of this incredible album. If I open it up and show you it. On the EMI double up label, let's get you right for you. Indo Jazz Fusions by the Joe Harriott and John Mayer group, double quintet, right? This is one of the true few fusion albums. I think it came out it was recorded around about 64, 65. This is saying that it came out, the copyright 67, but I think it was a bit before then. Joe Harriott was actually born in the West Indies, came to the UK in the 1950s, started, I think, working with the likes of Pat Smythe, and was that sort of post-alto sax player, post-Charlie Parker sort of a player. He started to explore aspects of free jazz a little bit before, or to be probably a little bit fairer, around about the same time as Ornette Coleman. I think you have to get into the weeds and listen to what Joe Harriott was doing with his explorations into free jazz at the end of the 1950s, because I think what he was exploring was a way of freeing up jazz which was different to Ornette Coleman and then the free jazz players that came in the 1960s. This on its own, being a leader in such a shift in jazz, being there first, of course, but him being British, meant that it was only a sort of esoteric cognoscenti of jazz fans who really knew what Joe Harriott had done. But Going into the 1960s, he then started to bring in modal ideas from Indian music, and with John Mayer, another great, I think he was a South African musician, but another great musician resident in America, in the UK, sorry. He then creates this album, Indo Jazz Fusions, and again innovates. Joe Harriott's playing style is incredible, and I can see why he invented free jazz in the way that he did, because his ideas are so lucid and concrete, and the direction that he plays from is so logical, so soulful. I mean, you could tell I'm a massive fan of Joe Harriott's playing. He can pull you through, and he can pull you out and beyond the music. There's a great debate, well, I say a great debate, there's a great debate that has gone on this channel, which is to whether he's related to Ainsley Harriott, the TV cook. I thought he was. I mentioned it on the channel. A couple of people messaged me and said he definitely wasn't. But I've been chatting with the historian, British historian Ben Finlay, who has collaborated on a series of videos that are coming out on the history of British music. And I think I'm going to sit down with Ben and do a video at some point on Joe Harriott, and hopefully we'll be able to work out whether he is related. But if anybody out there has any sort of contact with the cook Ainsley Harriott, he's the guy to come on and talk about this, because he's a great music fan, and that would be the ultimate video on Joe Harriott for me, and I'm the man to deliver it. We'll have Ben in there as well. So if anybody's got to come, not Rusty Lee, no, not Rusty Lee, don't want her. I've got a whole ton of contacts for Rusty Lee, because she used to live in my town, no longer, but I'm pretty sure I could get a number for Rusty Lee. But she's going to be no use at this section. I think I should have a puff on my imaginary pipe at this point in the video, because we're halfway. Shall we carry on? Shall we carry on? Because we're now going to come up against another British musician that I think was truly as great as any musician in the world, right? A real virtuoso on his instrument. And I'm going to pull this album out, an absolutely classic album, which I think represents British jazz, and I will hold it up thus, and I will hold it here for a time, and hopefully I can get... I mean, the light's strange. It's even brighter there, is it? Well, maybe I'll move there and put that there. We do have a very strange light going on. So, of course, this is the Jazz Couriers in Concert album with Ronnie Scott and Tubby Hayes. This is not the original copy, because if it was, it'd be worth about 500 quid. This is the Music for Pleasure version that came out in the late 60s. This is my dad's album. I did think it was the expensive one for many years, and it had its own plastic wallet and everything, because I thought this could well be the most expensive album in my collection. Maybe it is, maybe I've got it wrong, you know, but I don't think so. On this, we've got the great Ronnie Scott, Tubby Hayes on tenor sax, Terry Shannon on piano, Phil Bates on bass, and Bill Eden on drums. Tubby Hayes was just a force of nature. I don't think in the 50s anyone could touch him as an improviser. He has an ability to not only play fast but think fast, and within that his phrasing is incredible. He really is, for me, one of the greatest saxophone players to have ever lived. Obviously he lists to the likes of Charlie Parker, but I think there's a strong influence from Johnny Griffin in terms of the speed. Johnny Griffin was a very fast... this lighting, it's going like the end of Apocalypse Now. I'm turning into, you know, maybe I need to change it around a bit and not be so... What do you think? Oh my God, that's even worse. Look at that. I don't know what you can see. Shall we try that then? Shall we try that? Oh, the lighting's too harsh. The lighting's too harsh, isn't it? I mean, I can fall back into darkness. I think I'm gonna have to fall back into darkness, you know. I think that's the only way to get through this, because this light is getting even more piercing and I can't really see what's going on. So Tubby Hayes has this sort of, you know, incredible power, influenced by Johnny Griffin and another very speedy, fast player. But his phrasing is so incredible. He comes out of that post-bebop. He's killing it in Ronnie Scott's band. In the 1960s, he's a real household name here in the UK. He's appearing on television all the time. Really well known, really well loved. He has got the name Tubby because he's Tubby. I mean, that's back in the old days, you know. If you would, you know, Chubby Checker was called Chubby, wasn't he? Fat Swaller's called Fat Swaller. And Tubby, this is what they used to do in the old days, you know. It's like people could take it back then, or could he? But Tubby seemed to live life very large, and you know. He didn't last long. Like Joe Harriott, by the time you get to the 1970s, he had a heart attack and died pretty young, robbing us, my country, of one of the greatest jazz musicians we've ever produced. And I think he would have gone on in the 70s to have that international career. He did make an album. I've got 2 albums of Tubby Hayes. This is an incredible album. If you want an example of British jazz, if I was doing an encyclopedia on British jazz, I'd probably have that one. See if I can get it again, because that's lit up. Oh, look at it, it looks ever so strange, isn't it? I'd probably have that one on the cover of my book. That would be a great one to have. But the Tubby Hayes album I love is this one. Can you see that? That is called, if I can get it down here, Mexican Green. The opening track, Dear Johnny B, contains some of the greatest saxophone playing ever recorded. Love Tubby Hayes. Right, so we are now down, I believe, to the last 3. Now, the guy I've got at number 3, if I was being entirely objective, would be at number 1, but he's not. I'm going to have to try and explain not why he's not number 1, but why it's quite obvious to any objective ranker of musicians that this guy is perhaps the greatest British jazz musician in terms of talent, in terms of fame, in terms of innovation. Just an incredibly brilliant man. And you're probably racking your brains thinking, who the hell is this bloke? Because I don't think it's obvious. We do not in this country value this musician enough. Truly one of the greatest jazz musicians, full stop. George Shearing, and undoubtedly, I would say, the greatest, and this could make a good thumbnail as well, you know, I could go with that as well. I quite like the way that shadow's casting across that. George Shearing, born to a working class family, born blind, and he seems to have not just a special association with sound, with music, but also with sound. It's the famous thing about George Shearing, he used to enjoy hearing bottles smash on the floor. Although I think he enjoyed listening to them clanking on the floor. There's an interview he did somewhere where he said, you know, that beer bottles were like classical music, milk bottles were more like jazz. This guy could play classical music. His virtuosity on the instrument is astonishing. I think the reason why we aren't mentioning him is because his brilliance was more like Errol Garner than it was like Thelonious Monk. Errol Garner is one of the greatest pianists of the 20th century, but his style was accessible, and so was George Shearing. But you should not let that put you off. Those of you who want all this more angular, weird stuff, this guy could really play. He composed, he wrote 2 definite jazz standards, Lullaby of Birdland, and I think he wrote Conception, didn't he? Although that's not on here. This is the best of George Shearing. This album also belonged to my dad. He's an incredible player. Sold lots and lots of records, was played on the radio, appeared on television. This guy was known in the 1950s as one of the greatest jazz musicians in the world. And he's British. Where are the statues to George Shearing? You know, now, part of it, I think, is that his music was quite easy to listen to, but also he got out of the UK and went to America and was part of that post-bebop renaissance that happened in America. And that produced a lot of household names. This is the famous period where you could go, you know, to New York, see all these incredible players, Art Tate and all that. He was there at that time, an incredible player, lived to a very advanced age, George Shearing really should be not just seen as one of the great British players, but should be seen as one of the great players, full stop. And we should be saying his name in the same breath as Bill Evans or Oscar Peterson or Thelonious Monk or Bud Powell. He's in that bracket. You know, this is the problem with jazz. If anybody ever sells any records, they're like this, the snotty snobs. And they don't really get it. One of the big problems with jazz is never been able to respect and show its due to the guys that really sell records and go out and grab that audience. George Shearing makes high-level music. If you could listen and put your ears in on, between the speakers and listen to what he's playing, the way he voices his chords, the way the sort of double lines he runs, incredible. There's a video of him in his 80s on YouTube and he's playing Donna Lee. Look at the virtuosity of the guy, and everything's so easy to him. He was a true great musician, natural, just born with an incredible love of beauty that he was able to show on his instrument. I'm a big fan of George Shearing. Right, so we're at number 2 now. So who have I got at number 2? Well, again, this guy's bloody obvious. He's changed the shape of jazz, albeit it's taken a while for it to A, sink in, and B, for people to appreciate this guy's genius. I believe this is perhaps the greatest musician of the last 60 years, right? As an instrumentalist, but he was also an incredible composer and an incredible explorer of sound on his instrument. It is, of course, this guy, Allan Holdsworth. I've gone and grabbed my vinyl copy of Road Games because this is not everyone's got this one. I didn't know which one to get, and for me, I heard Holdsworth the first time on the Land of Cocaine Soft Machine, and then I heard him with Gong, and he was my favourite guitarist at that point. I loved everything he did. The first Holdsworth album I got was either IOU or I think it was this one. I think this is the first solo album. Although this isn't a full album, it's a mini album. This is the famous album that was on Warner Brothers. It was produced by Ted Templeman. Allan Holdsworth did not want to do anything that Ted had in mind, and so the recording broke down. It's an incredible recording because there's money behind it. There's vocals on here. I always love Holdsworth, and he's got vocals on. He goes on to make more exploratory albums later on, but Holdsworth's solo albums, in terms of the way he composes, the way he voices his chords, the lines he plays, obviously, and the sound of the lines he plays, I think has become the most dominant influence on improvising musicians across all the instruments. So obviously somebody like Michael Brecker really changes the sound of saxophone players, tenor saxophone players. It's by 1990 you're wading through people who sound like Michael Brecker. With Holdsworth, that has become true in terms of the guitar now, but when I listen to keyboard players playing or saxophone players, there is a certain a legato approach, utilizing certain scales, but playing scales in a certain way. This sound I've really tried to get into. On guitar, Holdsworth would use 4 note per strings, which meant that his scales were horizontal rather than vertical. On the guitar you play across, but his hands were so big he could cover a large part. 4 notes of a scale is more than halfway, and so he could run a whole octave just on 2 strings. And when he plays that in certain combinations, gives a rolling sound. It's not just playing fast. It's not playing fast like a bebop musician. It's florid. Now, the musician that I heard doing this for the first time in sort of music history, in terms of improvisation, is probably Bill Evans. Bill Evans does not play fast, but when he does, he has this incredibly rolling sound. And I think Holdsworth's transference of Bill Evans onto guitar, something that Lenny Breau did as well. And when Lenny Breau plays fast, he often has this sort of, somersaulting fast sound that we associate with Holdsworth. That has become so ubiquitous on virtually every instrument that if a musician is worth their, is worth anything, they have to be able to do that, and they have to be able to use altered scales. Holdsworth really, I think, made the Messiaen modes, these symmetrical scales like the whole half tone scale, the whole tone scale, the Messiaen mode, which is a whole tone with a chromatic note in between. He made these stock things. I learnt about this from Holdsworth, and I went from just playing modally with a bit of pentatonics and a few things like that to suddenly trying to drop these scales into my playing. His influence is so huge now. His virtuosity was so extreme that for many years people couldn't deal with it. And guitarists would poo-poo him. I remember when I was into him in the 80s, they went, oh, it's just speed, it's just technique, there's no feel there. And I know people who watch this channel will jump across when I, wax so lyrically about Holdsworth, and they'll put it on and they go, oh, it just sounds like a bunch of random notes. And that's their fault. It's because their ears aren't good enough. There's no worry about it, there's no problem. You don't have to be able to hear what I can hear, or us, more erudite listeners. You see, people can't deal with it. That's the truth. They can't deal with the idea that Holdsworth's doing something so esoteric that half the world doesn't understand it. So they just want to go, well, there's nothing there then. It's the emperor's new clothes. And then when we say there isn't, they go, why are they? And they'll never know. They will never know. And there's even fans of Holdsworth that are only appreciating him for the chops, but they don't feel it. Holdsworth's real innovation for me was the way he mapped his quirky and yet depressed worldview onto the instrument. Depressed's not the word, melancholic is probably a better word for Holdsworth's sound. Coltrane had the same thing, and of course Coltrane was a huge influence on Allan Holdsworth. But undoubtedly, in terms of influence on modern musicians, Allan Holdsworth's here at number 2. So who's at number 1? Anybody who knows me knows who's at number 1. All right, the thing is where I put the album. I've lost my album. I had it here. Who do you think I've got at number 1? Go on, shout it out now. No, not them. No, not them. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Before we get into who I've got at number 1, because I really have lost the bloody album. Where the hell is it? God, where's it? Where are you? I don't think I brought it over. So, it's down here. Down here. Right, so before we do number 1, just to build the tension up, although it's bloody obvious, anyone who knows me knows what's going to be number 1. Right, but let's do a couple of musicians that were bubbling under that I felt that we should be talking about. Right, make sure I've got them all. Right, I'm going the right mess here. It's because I didn't have one album per person. Normally I have one album per person, and then I know where I am. But here I've got 2 or 3, and they're just all over the bloody place, and I don't know which goes where. Right, so lurking underneath. God, he so should have been on it. The great Ian Carr, the guy behind the fusion band Nucleus. That's probably one to get from 1970, Elastic Rock. Ian Carr was a huge Miles Davis fan, but he was unaware of Miles's forays into jazz fusion at the end of the 60s. He hadn't heard them. And he logically took what Miles was doing and he went into his own version and came up with something very similar. And on these albums, this and Belladonna, he really is punching above his weight in terms of innovation in jazz rock fusion. The lineup on this is Ian Carr, trumpet. We got Carl Jenkins on baritone, oboe, piano, Hohner, and electric piano. Carl Jenkins, of course, then went on to be the keyboard player in Soft Machine. If Soft Machine was a person, they would be on this list, but they're not. And then Carl Jenkins went on to make, he started doing compositions for adverts, and now he is probably the most popular classical composer in the world, although his classical compositions, some would say, were lightweight. I don't. I think he's great. He's got an incredible moustache. Recently I had one of these moustaches, and I wanted to look like someone out of Soft Machine. I really did. I wanted to look like, what was his name on the keyboards, Mike Ratledge or somebody like that. But I shaved it off when Tim Bonus said, well, you look like a sexier Carl Jenkins, which for me, didn't feel like I'd achieved much, really. Anyway, that's by the by. Classic album, Elastic Rock. If you're a Fusion fan, you gotta get it. This cover was created by Roger Dean, I believe, and when you open it, it's got a hole in it, and it opens. Oh, the fire of the volcano! Another guy that I think worked quietly in the world of jazz rock fusion throughout the 70s, contributing to a whole host of incredible albums, but also with his Chrome Waterfall album created an absolute masterpiece, is the composer and arranger Mike Gibbs. Although I haven't this time pulled out the Chrome Waterfall, because this is another great album by him, and I haven't spoke about this one so much. This is the Mike Gibbs Orchestra. This is a great big band. He put this out in 1988. It's called Big Music. The lineup is brilliant on here. Just to give you an idea, on bass we've got Kai Eckhart, who went on to play with John McLaughlin. We got Bob Moses on drums. We've got Bad Bill Martin on electronic drums. We've got Dave Fizinski on guitar, John Schofield on guitar, Bill Frisell on guitar, and the great Kevin Eubanks on guitar. And then we got Lou Marini on tenor saxophone, Lou Soloff on trumpet, Ian Carr is on trumpet, didn't realise he was on this album, and Mike Gibbs is on trombone and piano. This is a fantastic album, and it was made in the 1980s, so it's a great jazz fusion jazz album from the 1980s, and they're few and far between. This is a great album. Schofield especially is great on this. And then my last sort of nearly made it is, of course, Bill Bruford, that has spent the last 40 years playing jazz, right, bringing jazz to the masses. He is an incredible drummer. He, I believe, takes his style from the spirit of many British jazz drummers. I hear that crisp attack in drummers like Alan Ganley. He told me when I interviewed him that he grew up listening to watching Jazz 625 on the TV in the 1960s, so that makes sense, because Alan Ganley would often appear there. With this group, Bruford, and I've pulled out one of the sort of lesser discussed albums, because this is a brilliant album for Bill Bruford. Yeah, the Holdsworth's left in, he's not on here. We've got the unknown John Clark on here. But in terms of what Jeff Berlin, Dave Stewart and Bill Bruford's doing, it's an upgrade. This is a great album. Of course, he then was his band Earthworks in the 1980, hooked up with Django Bates, and then went on to make a whole bunch of jazz albums. Obviously, when he got to the age of 60, he's had enough and he retired. But he's back, isn't he, old Bill? He's back out there with the Pete Roth Trio, and he's playing jazz. He's a jazz musician, and I think Bill has been so important in British jazz in a way that, although it's a lesser thing compared to his importance in the world of progressive rock and what he did on those albums, right, it's still, in the smaller world of British jazz, a very important thing, But of course, who have I got at number one? Well, I pulled out an album by this guy which I think represents a period of British jazz where, although it's not been documented in history, was the most important period in terms of British jazz. It was the late 60s, and a lot of these musicians were laying the groundwork for music that would go on outside that world. I'm of course talking about John McLaughlin, my hero, probably your hero. I've got his debut album here, Extrapolation, with the original cover. Got to have it with the original cover. On here we have got John Surman on baritone and soprano saxophone, Brian Hodges on bass, and the incredible Tony Oxley on drums, one of my favourite drummers. The engineer on this is Eddie Offord, who would then go on to do Yes. It's produced by Giorgio Gamelski, who would go on to do all sorts of proggy things in his career. And so we see that these musicians that have come into London, that are doing session work, but are also playing out and bringing in all these different influences, are laying the groundwork for a whole remit of music. When we go through here, there's some notes that John wrote for each track. Extrapolation, past and present incidences focused into the future. So on his first album, he's looking into the future. Now, of course, he's going to go to America, play with Miles Davis, join Tony Williams' band, form the Mahavishnu Orchestra, change music completely, and become, I believe, the most influential, the most important, and one of the biggest selling British jazz musicians of all time. He is a legend in every single country. This is undoubtedly the UK's greatest jazz musician. Now, would the British jazz scene say that? Of course they wouldn't. And I've done too many videos having a go at the bloody British jazz scene, but this is one of the main things, is that they cannot champion their great musicians. There is an insecurity and a snottiness combined, and they would rather carve out their own little world than actually, point where the real true genius is. And we know that this guy is a genius. It's Funny, which was written with the unheard lyrics by the incomparable Dusty Dower, reflecting his opposite result, Sad Joy. Dusty Dower, I don't know why he spelt it like that. That's not the name of the person he's referring to. He's referring to Duffy Power, who was a singer. He was part of the Larry Parnes gang, along with Marty Wilde, Johnny Gentle, Billy Fury. My father-in-law, Peter Wynne, was signed up with Larry Parnes at the same time, knew Duffy Power. And my mother-in-law was very close friends with Duffy Power. What John McLaughlin was doing with Duffy Power around about 64, 65 was so in the future. If you want to check that out, there is an album called something like Innovations that came out in the early 70s. Check out John McLaughlin and Duffy Power. Often teamed up with Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce, two musicians that really should be on this list. Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce are jazz musicians. They should be on this list. But then when we open the door, then we think, well, Mitch Mitchell's a jazz musician. It starts to open the door to a realm which British jazz cannot or will not take the claim for, because they don't want to associate with something bigger than themselves. This is a shame. Argan's Bag, dedicated to Dave Holland, greatest musician and bass player, and his bag. So there he's pointing to Dave Holland, who was down to play on this album and had to leave because he'd gone to play with Miles. There's a dedication to Pete the poet, to Pete Brown, who was a poet in London, died a couple of years back. It was very important in terms of the development of what we call heavy metal, progressive rock, jazz rock fusion, all the stuff we talk about on this channel. In fact, there's an argument that this is the nexus of that. This is it. So that there has been my 10 greatest British jazz musicians. Contentious, but I hope I've argued my case. I hope I've entertained you, and most importantly, I hope I have pointed you to a couple of albums that you can go and check out now and see whether you think they're as great as I think they are. Thank you for watching this video. Like and subscribe, put some comments in there. I have a Patreon with more content than you will get through in the rest of your life. There's so much there. I was looking through it the other day. I thought, bloody hell, I've forgotten I'd even done half of this. I got a Patreon. I got a PayPal tip jar. My comments on British jazz recently And the attacks that I have taken means that my income here is lessened. That's all I'm going to say. So if you want to help me out, I would appreciate it very much. Thank you for watching. See you on the next one.